I'm an associate of the Eisenhower chapter it's called the Triangle Veterans for Peace. The Triangle in North Carolina refers to Durham, Raleigh, and Chapel Hill.
Right. Yeah.
And I wish I had worn it tonight. I was using the shirt, but I actually went into prison wearing my Veterans for Peace shirt that also said Black Lives Matter on it. And it actually got me in trouble right from the get-go. I walked in and the guards, the white guards, immediately commented negatively on my shirt. And it was interesting because there was a young Black man in his early 20s who was self-reporting, just as I was. My wife left me off at the prison, and we were both reporting last January to prison to begin our sentences. And it so happened we were both being brought into the prison complex at the same time. So when the guards started, saying snide remarks about my T-shirt, like something like, "Oh, he's really trying to make friends when he comes here," or something like that, I turned to D'Angelo, the African-American man from Chicago, who was 24. And I said, "Well, D'Angelo, what do you think of my shirt?" And he said, "Well, I like it." And I said, "Well, that's all that matters." But it was, so Veterans for Peace got me in trouble my first day at the
Good trouble, as they say. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I think it would be a good idea for, since Patrick is curious where we're from, for everybody to briefly introduce yourself, say your name and where you're from, and then maybe we'll ask Ellen to formally introduce Patrick, and then Patrick can get started. How about you, Greg? You're up in the corner there. My corner, anyway.
My name is Greg Corning, and I'm just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Okay. And I'm Jerry Condon, and this is my partner, Helen Jaccard, and we're up here in Northern California with Veterans for Peace. Ken?
I'm Ken Mayers. I'm in the Santa Fe chapter.
Harvey, you introduced yourself already. How about Alice? Alice?
Alice Slater. I'm from New York City, the lands of the Lenape.
We're close together, Alice. We could go meet for a cup of coffee after this.
Oh, are you in New York?
Yeah, I'm on 16th Street.
Oh, with the Catholic Worker Group there.
I came into town for, this is my first time getting to see some family since I've been in prison. So I'm also meeting with some Catholic workers. In fact, Dorothy Day's granddaughter was the person who just passed behind me.
That's Martha, right? Martha Henderson.
That's Martha Henderson, right? She walked by.
Ellen Barfield?
Oh, Patrick knows me. I'm the co-founder of the Phil Berrigan Memorial Baltimore chapter of VFP, and I'm part of the support for the Kings Bay Plowshares.
Indeed, she is.
This is Jim Wolgamuth from the Hector Black chapter in Nashville.
All right. We've got a lot of geography represented here. That's great.
The whole world is here.
Yeah.
Wendy Rogan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Rogan from Orange County, California. I'm a Golden Rule supporter and also a council member with Nevada Desert Experience in Las Vegas.
Great, thank you for being here. Paul, you're muted. Do you want to introduce yourself? There you go.
Yeah, Paul Gessler, Veterans for Peace in Northern Colorado.
Okay, great. Well, we're already recording. And Ellen, if you'd like the honor of formally introducing Patrick.
I'd love that. Did Greg introduce himself? He did. Okay. Yeah, I'm Ellen Thomas. I'm with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I live in the mountains of North Carolina, and a number of years ago, I spent 18 years in front of the White House with the Vigil Against Nuclear Weapons and for sanity. And that's how I met Patrick, was he wrote a story about us. And also the Dorothy Day Catholic workers are very active in Washington, DC, and we're good friends with them, and participated in a lot of the Atlantic Life community activities, and went to every Plowshares meeting that I possibly could. And so I went to the trial and to the sentencing of the Kings Bay Plowshares. And I've loved the people. I miss the people, and I'm very glad to see that you're out, Patrick. Patrick is a journalist who writes for the National Catholic Reporter, and I'm sure that you have a lot of other things that you can tell people what you are doing, and I'll let you take over.
Well, I don't think Ellen, I think Ellen was present for both of my White House arrests, and a couple of times when they didn't arrest me, many times when they didn't. But I was also arrested at the Pentagon 7 times too. So I've spent a lot of time in Washington going to jail. So I'll tell you a little bit of background. I turned 65 years old in solitary confinement at Federal Correctional Institution, Elkton in Northeastern Ohio, not far from Pittsburgh. It's a dismal place, as most prisons are. And I spent most of my time, almost all of my time, in fact, locked down. We were locked down ostensibly because of COVID, but it was just a place where they warehouse men at this particular prison. And I also spent more than 2.5 months ostensibly being quarantined, but it was in solitary confinement for more than a month of that. So they're quarantining you when you pass a COVID test. I didn't fail a COVID test. I went into quarantine all 3 times having passed a COVID test. And what they would impose on you is solitary confinement, which is the worst punishment they have in federal prison, but they gave it to people who had passed a COVID test. So it was a form of torture, really. It doesn't really take long for most people to go a little bit stir crazy in solitary. And if anybody, solitary, the average bathroom in an apartment building, where if you stood up in the bathroom, you could touch both walls of the bathroom on either side of you. The solitary cells are that small, and I went 15 days without ever getting out of the cell. They would just hand your food in through a little slot in the door, and I was being treated just like everybody else. It wasn't anything exceptional. This is just the way they treat people. And despite the fact that the court decided that I was not such a great risk that I could have my wife drive me to prison and let me off there, I didn't have to be brought there in handcuffs and chains. That didn't matter. Once I got to the prison, I became a very dangerous person, a great threat to community safety. And to add to this, I had a point at which I had started a new blood pressure medicine that I had an adverse reaction to. And it caused me to get to break out in this horrible sweat and have to sit down on the floor of my cell block where I really kind of felt like I was going to pass out. And so I went over to medical, and they hooked me up to an EKG and said I needed to go to the hospital. Now, keep in mind that I've run 9 marathons and my heart is in excellent condition. For a 65-year-old, I run frequently, more than 5 miles a day. I run every day. They brought me to the hospital. They brought me to the hospital in chains. I was chained with leg irons. The leg irons were attached to a gurney. I had a chain around my waist and handcuffs attached to the waist chain. That's how I was transported to the hospital. And chained like that is how I remained for the entire 4 days I was in the hospital. I was chained to a bed, not allowed to contact my wife and tell her where I was. They didn't tell her where I was when she called the prison. So I was being treated as if I was a serial killer or something. I mean, there was no justification for that kind of inhumanity. Again, that's how everybody's treated. Everybody's treated the same way. And I met people in prison, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but they had mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and even children who died. They were never allowed to go to a wake or a funeral. And they were in for nonviolent crimes for the most part. So it was really a form of horrible brutality for these guys. And, when I finally went to a halfway house in August, I was in with guys who had done 15 years in prison. Now that's an interesting for people to know. The federal government pays $60,000 a year to keep a person in federal prison. So if you're in there for 14 years, that's $1 million the government has spent on you. The day you leave the prison, they don't even hand you a $20 bill. So what was happening is guys were doing 5, 10, 15 years in prison, going to a halfway house, and from the halfway house, home confinement was an eligibility. So many of these guys had no homes to go to that they just had to stay in the halfway house until their sentences expired. Then they went into homeless shelters. So there's nothing rehabilitative or in any way productive that these prisons are doing for people at all, nothing at all. It's terrible. I want to step back a little bit. My connection and why I love Veterans for Peace so much is because my father was a veteran, a Navy veteran of the Korean War. My father-in-law, my wife's father, was he was in the Marine Corps. Then he left the Marine Corps to go, and he served in Korea, just like my dad did. And then he went to Cornell and got a degree in labor relations, but went back into the Marine Corps and became a lifer and got 2 Purple Hearts in Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot. And my father-in-law, of course, after he got out of that environment, that militaristic environment, and he wasn't, the brainwashing wasn't quite as thorough as it was when he was in that. And he and my mother-in-law ended up being the greatest supporters of the Catholic Worker House that my wife, Mary Ryder, and I started in 1991. And I'll tell one quick story about Jim Ryder, my father-in-law. He was a very devout Catholic. For those who don't know what that means, he was a Marian Catholic. He liked to pray to the Blessed Mother as a saint intercessor, which the Catholic Church sees anyone who's gone on to the next world, to the next life, to heaven, as a saint intercessor. So you can pray to anybody who's died, and just like I could ask any one of you, please keep me in your prayers. You can ask that to people who have died. So he was a very strong Marian Catholic and believed in the intercessory power of the saints. And at one point, I wrote an op-ed about my actions, my plowshare action, going to prison and so on. And this was another plowshare action, not this one. The other one. This is one I spent 2 years in prison for back in the 80s. This was down in Orlando, Florida. And but I wrote it to a Catholic publication, and there were some critical letters responding to what I wrote. And so he wrote a letter to the editor responding, and he said, based on and he was a lieutenant colonel at this point, just having retired. He said, based on my knowledge of the security around these weapon systems, I don't believe that priests and nuns and unarmed pacifists could gain access to these weapons without the direct aid of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, I support them. So it was really quite a remarkable thing that he supported me so deeply and wonderfully. A lot of you know about the Kings Bay Plowshares, but I'll give a little overview for those who, like Ellen, didn't come to the trial and don't know much about it. The Plowshares movement began in 1980, and it really came on the heels of the anti-Vietnam War movement. This was sort of a rebirth of the draft board raids that were prolific during the Vietnam War, where people would break into draft boards and take out the files, the 1A files, and burn them with homemade napalm or pour blood on them. And these were direct action. And so the Plowshares movement came out of that. And it was actually started by the same 2 people who started the draft board raids, Daniel and Philip Berrigan, 2 Catholic priests, both now deceased, who were on the cover of Time magazine in 1971 for their incredible, earth-shattering work against the Vietnam War that really changed the whole way people of faith looked at war and looked at their opposition to it. It was I think that Phil and Dan Berrigan and Elizabeth McAllister, who's my co-defendant now, Phil's widow, I think that they really had an enormous impact on the anti-war movement in this country and changed the way people looked at war and resistance to it. So the Plowshares movement involves basically taking household hammers, going to a place where weapons of mass destruction are, and hammering on them. And the hammering would be very symbolic. You would make a few dents, set your hammer down, and await arrest, which is consistent with the acceptance of responsibility component of nonviolent resistance. So on the one hand, you put a few dents in some metal, but on the other hand, you're realistic about the fact that disarmament can't happen unless it becomes a matter of the heart before it becomes a matter of change of any meaningful level. So, but I always tell people the government never appreciates the symbolic nature of my actions. The consequences are severe. So anyway, we, the 7 of us, including a Jesuit priest, Father Steve Kelly, Martha Hennessy, who waved when she went by a little while ago, and 5 others. As I mentioned, Elizabeth McAllister. We went to Kings Bay, which is a base down in Southeast Georgia, right on the Florida line, just north of Jacksonville. And we went there on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. And
You just muted yourself.
can people hear me now? I'm not sure. I didn't touch anything, so I'm not sure what happened, but sorry about that. Anyway, where did I leave off? What did you stop hearing me? Can anybody tell me what they didn't hear? Like how long was I not?
Martin Luther King's assassination was the
Okay.
last thing you said.
Okay, that was the day that we went on to the Kings Bay Naval Station to oppose the Trident submarine. For those who don't know, and probably all of you do know, that the Trident submarine is the most diabolical weapon system ever created in the history of the world. It's like I tell people, when you see the Trident submarine float by in Kings Bay, you're basically looking at the end of the world. A Trident submarine represents the end of the human experiment. If used, it's over. I mean, we're playing with the elimination of life as we know it on the planet. It's horrible. And it was interesting. We hammered on some statues of nuclear weapons, and I thought to myself, I wish I could have been present at the gathering of these Navy personnel who were trying to design the entranceway to the base so it would be attractive to people coming into the base. And they came up with the idea of, well, let's build some statues of nuclear weapons and surround them by American flags and military flags and a nice sign proclaiming who we are. And so this is what they decided, that weapons of mass destruction, maybe a dozen of them on display as statues, was an appropriate thing to do. That was a way to somehow show people how wonderful this base was. So anyway, I was in. It was dark on that night we went in, and I had a hammer that I got from Shane Claiborne from the Simple Way in Philadelphia. It's a pacifist community there, and he had gotten some hammers that were made from melted down guns. So I had one of these hammers. So I came out from, I went up to the statue that, that was kind of lit up at night. And I went to swing my hammer on the statue of the Trident II D5 missile. And immediately the head of my hammer broke off because the statue was made of cement. And it was a formidable idol. I couldn't really do any damage to it. So Father Steve Kelly and Elizabeth McAllister and Carmen Trotta, 3 of my co-defendants, they made their way to the bunkers there. We assumed that the bunkers, because they had three fence lines around them and guard towers that had Marines with sharpshooters in them, that this was probably a place where nuclear weapons were stored. So they went there and held banners against the nuclear weapons. And then 2 people, Claire and Martha, went to the administration building where they put an indictment of the Navy for making weapons of mass destruction that were illegal under international law even before the treaty, and put crime scene tape on the door of the building, poured blood. We also spray painted the word idol on all of the statues and so on. So like I said, we awaited arrest and were charged with 3 felonies and a misdemeanor. I was ultimately convicted. All 7 of us were convicted of depredating government property. And depredate is an interesting word. It means to plunder, to lay to waste, or to prey upon. So we were ultimately convicted of depredating the ultimate depredator. We also were convicted of conspiracy, trespassing, and damaging naval property. And for that, we received sentences from 10 months to 33 months. The 7 of us, all of us went to prison, or in the case, everybody went to prison. In the case of Liz McAllister and Steve, they served most of their time in jail. So they didn't accept any release options and didn't get out of jail. So, and I spent time in jail, 2 jails, a federal prison, a halfway house, and then a few weeks in home confinement until just my sentence just officially concluded November 19th. But now I'm serving 3 years of probation, which is supervised and so far restricted, but we'll see how it goes. If I can manage to go the 3 years without getting violated and sent back to prison, it will be unprecedented. But we'll see what happens. We'll see how it goes. I'm not all that cooperative on a lot of levels. But I did want to say one thing. The time that I went to prison in Orlando, I was on a radio show that had a call-in phone. People could call into the show, and I was kind of telling my story like I am now. And they opened up the phone lines, and a guy called in, and he just laced into me. He said, "I'm a taxpayer. I'm a U.S. citizen. My money paid for those weapons that you hammered on. You destroyed my property." He was taking it very, very personally, which I thought was, he was proud of the weapons, and he was stating his opinion. I think that's probably the way most Americans would feel about it, actually. But anyway, I let him kind of, air his frustrations and his disappointment and anger with me. And I said, sir, I really want to affirm everything you're saying. You're right. I damaged property that your tax dollars paid for. I took the law into my own hands, as you said. And in fact, that's why I'm going to prison. You're absolutely right about that. And I'm sorry you feel that way about it, but I certainly understand why you feel that way. I said, but I would like to pose one question to you. I'm going to prison for denting some metal and chipping some paint. And those weapons, if used, could destroy and kill millions and millions of people. And that does not give you any pause at all. You have nothing to say about that. And I'm just curious why. And I don't remember what his answer was. But that's the thing is, I say this all the time. Those of us who work for peace, and of course, people who are in Veterans for Peace have more credibility because you've also worked for war and you know the consequences of that. It's not as easy for a person in my situation whose father went to war and who grew up during Vietnam and decided to resist war to have the same credibility. But I'm still sort of taken aback by the fact that all of us now who speak for peace, and of course all Veterans for Peace who speak for peace, their situation is different now. They've sacrificed their credibility as veterans. Like in our Eisenhower chapter in Raleigh, for years we were excluded from the Veterans Day parade. We're in it now, although we're the very last float. We're at the end of the parade, which is kind of nice because people clap for us because we're the last ones. But it was hard to get credibility as Veterans for Peace. And the thing that's kind of amazing to me is that the reason that all of us are outliers in our culture is because we don't believe in killing people. That's the bottom line. All we're saying is something very, very basic and simple. We don't believe in killing people. And unfortunately, that's what makes us outliers in this culture. We don't believe in killing people. So that's what I remind people of, that, you're really saying to me that I'm the weirdo, I'm the oddball, because I just don't think we should kill each other. And I am a father of 8 children. I have 6 daughters and 2 sons. And I certainly didn't raise any of my children to kill people. And in fact, all 8 of my children were active and are active in Black Lives Matter and other peace movement related work. So they have rebelled at me in many ways, but at least not when it comes to that. So I'm glad about that. As everybody knows, this week the House passed the War Appropriations Act. And ironically and tragically, the Congress is giving the Pentagon more money. I think it's $24 billion more than that. $741 last year, and it's right. It's getting up close to $780 or something this year. and still the details haven't been completely worked out. And the vote in the House was, of course, really lopsided. Last year's War Appropriations Act vote in the Senate was 86-14. So, the Pentagon and the military industrial complex comfortably gets well beyond veto protection when you get 84 votes in the Senate, which is remarkable, right? When everybody's saying, oh, the Senate has never been more divided. Congress has never been more divided than they are now. Nobody crosses the aisle for any reason. Well, they do for war. They do for war, and they do for nuclear weapons. And there's no disagreement. Very little disagreement on the war making. And it is kind of nice. Who's in New York? Is Helen here? Was a woman named Helen here? But anyway, where it turned out that the Congress people in the New York metropolitan area voted 8-5 against the War Appropriations Act. So we had good votes up here in New York City, which was really great. That's probably the most lopsided anti-war voting bloc that there is in the country. So I was glad to be here, at least after getting all that bad news. And, you do the math on the War Appropriations Act, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, but we're talking about somewhere between $1 million and $2 million a minute for every minute of the year. I mean, it's an astounding, almost incomprehensible amount of money that we're devoting to an absolutely useless product. So that's something that we're working against and we're working to expose. In prison, and I'll tell a few experiences about prison. When I got to prison, there were two primary groups in this prison. It so happened that this prison that I got sent to, which was quite far away from my home, 550 miles away from North Carolina, where I live, to northeastern Ohio. And in theory, the Bureau of Prisons is not supposed to send you that far away from home. They're supposed to keep you close to your family so they can visit and things like that. But they sent me there intentionally because of my prior organizing of inmates during my previous federal prison sentences. And so they have a long memory of my activism in prison. And so I was in a prison, like I said, that was locked down the whole time. And I probably got out of the cell to exercise for 1 hour every 4 or 5 days that I was there. The rest of the time I was locked down in a cell block with 115 other men, generally around that many. And there were no windows, there was no fresh air, there was no social distancing. It was quite a dangerous place. In fact, this prison had the highest outbreak of COVID of any prison in the country. And they also had 9 inmate deaths. And the Federal Bureau of Prisons had more than 250 inmate deaths. So as far as I know, none of those people who died had a death sentence. Certainly not the 9 in the prison I was in. So the prison had mostly African-American men who were in for drug-related charges. And then it was a prison that dealt with people who were known, they're known derogatorily as sex offenders, but essentially what they are people who looked at child pornography on their computers. That was what their crime was. In fact, it's the only thing that you can do on the internet that involves viewing something that can land you in prison. I mean, you can look at the most absolutely disgusting, horrific things on the internet. Obviously, everybody knows that there's all sorts of trash on the internet, but this is the only thing that you can do that lands you in prison. You're viewing child pornography, not manufacturing it, not engaging in it, but viewing it. And you could easily go to prison for 10 years for that. So there were a lot of white men in the prison who were there for that. Those were the two main groups. So I spent a lot of time interviewing people of all different kinds of reasons for being there. But one of the things I did was I really tried to bond with the African-American and Latino men who were there. And I was welcomed into both of their groups, and I was really happy that I got into the Black prayer group as the only white person who did. And I also joined the white prayer group, which was primarily made up of people who had got charged with these child pornography crimes. And they I think in both cases, I think I might have been the only person in the white prayer group that was not charged with something like that. But I did spend a lot of time interviewing people about their sentences and what happened to them, and I also got the phone numbers of their wives and their children so that I could interview them and tell their stories in a book. So I'm going to be working on that. The prison system is an utter failure. It mirrors the Pentagon, although ironically, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has 122 prisons and a budget of just under $8 billion a year. And the Pentagon has a budget 100 times more than that. And so the federal prison bureaucracy is a total failure, and the Pentagon has 100 times more money. I mean, their budget is just under for 1 year, $80 billion. So 80 billion versus not 80 billion, 800 billion. So 800 billion versus 8 billion. It's almost 100 times more money that goes to the Pentagon. So what I'll do is I guess I'll wrap up there and give you an opportunity to ask some questions or for me to fill in the gaps, if that's okay.
I'd be interested in hearing any conversations you had with prisoners about your own activities with Kings Bay Plowshares and the peace movement and how they responded, what they had to say.
I had good experiences with that. In fact, I went in there with books, trying to get people interested in, and people are very, I mean, of course, African Americans get it.
Yeah.
They get it very clearly. There was an older Black man. I don't know I'm trying to remember how old he was, but close to 70, Vietnam War veteran. He said, me and my fellow Black Army soldiers, he said, we always got sent to the front lines. We were the first ones, right to the front lines. And during Vietnam, so we were cannon fodder. And so they understood that they understood about war, and they understood about war resistance, and they understood about the consequences of a displaced federal budget. So it wasn't a hard sell. And of course, Ellen mentioned that I'm a writer, and over the course of my journalism career, which, dates back to 1980, if you don't count my high school writing, but I got to interview Coretta Scott King, her daughter Yolanda, Martin Luther King III, Shirley Chisholm, Jesse Jackson probably 3 or 4 times, Andy Young, Vincent Harding. So I had a pretty rich history of writing about the civil rights movement and bringing it into the modern age. And I was really sorry that I didn't get a chance to interview John Lewis. But anyway, a lot of the black inmates were really interested in that phase of my work. And so I shared it with them, or got some of the copies of some of the articles and had them mailed into them. But with regard to other inmates, I shared articles I wrote, articles that were sent in to me. So like People's History of the United States, I left that behind for people to share. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading because you get a different perspective. We had a book study of Born on the 4th of July, which is a pretty easy read. So we had a little book study with that. Stanley Hauerwas is a friend of mine who's a professor. He's the premier professor of moral ethics in the world. He's retired from Duke Divinity School. If you're interested in looking at a theological perspective on pacifism, get Stanley's book called Resident Aliens. And there's one line in there where he quotes somebody saying that sacrificing your life or risking your life for the United States military is like saying you'll risk your life for the phone company. But I shared the readings and had a lot of conversations with people. There was a Quaker guy who was in a couple of cell blocks down from me, and he had a lot of good literature too, and I would share that with people. And so I had a lot of good conversations, and you could see a lot of people's hearts being transformed by it, and so I did have a lot of good opportunities to share with people.
Patrick, this is Jerry Condon. I think it's really very admirable that you're now advocating for prisoners and for justice in the prison system and for sharing how much inhumanity, how inhumane and ineffective the prison system is. So kudos for that, and I'd be happy to hear more about it. But my question right now is more about, we're all kind of struggling with strategy. How do we build a movement that can really end nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war? And how do you see, what insights have you gained in that regard? And how do you see the Plowshares type of actions in the framework of an overall strategy? Is this something you would like to see happening on more of a massive scale? I know that Catholic worker, oftentimes the witnesses is equally important. The concept of witness is equally important as the concept of a strategy, perhaps. But I just wanted to throw that out and see what insights you have in terms of where you'd like to see the anti-nuclear movement going, and what's the place for direct action such as Plowshares within that?
Well, the draft board raised during the Vietnam War and the Plowshares movement, the Plowshare movement has now been around for we're in our 42nd year since the Berrigan brothers and 6 others did the first Plowshare action back in 1980. And there's been about 100 of them. So, I mean, it points to the fact that it's not an incredibly popular thing for people to do, but, and it's a lot. I mean, one time I was taking a poetry course once at a historically Black college in North Carolina called North Carolina Central University. And I had an African professor, and he made the comment that rich people who drive cars don't start revolutions, talking about Americans in general. So this is, sadly and tragically, the thing that gives me some hope in a real backward way is that the climate crisis now is really gaining the kind of popularity as a movement that the anti-nuclear movement had in the early 1980s, culminating with the second special session on disarmament at the United Nations in 1982, which incidentally, there were people said 3/4 to 1/4 to 1 million people marched, at the UN that day in June of 1982. And, I think internationally speaking, probably the climate crisis is now even more, a greater and deeper, more international commitment to stop global warming and sea level rise and all of the accompanying horrific consequences of the world's carbon footprint. So that's where I'm saying that I'm tragically hopeful, because I think now you notice, I guess all of you notice, that the climate change deniers are not anywhere near getting the credibility that they had even just 5 years ago. There's pretty much a scientific consensus now that we're in big trouble our creation is in big trouble, that we're tinkering, we're tinkering with the human experiment. We're tinkering with the death of creation because of what we're doing. And so I'm hoping that consensus, and keep in mind that the military industrial complex is the enemy of progress to reduce climate change. The military industrial complex has absolutely no concern about the consequences that their actions are having on climate change. So, I mean, they might be concerned, like in Tidewater, where the Navy has its biggest presence in the country. They're working at raising the buildings and the docks and the ports, because they know sea level rising is really happening. But they're preparing for it not by stopping it. They're preparing for it by saying, yes, we have to continue this process of war making. We can't stop it. So I think it's only going to be a matter of time, because all of us are saying this. Look at the Pentagon's climate footprint. Look at the Pentagon's carbon footprint. Look at it. Look at it. They're making a product that's completely and totally useless. There's never been a time in human history where the need for diplomacy and international cooperation has been greater than it is now. You know, the ocean doesn't stop rising at South Carolina's border when you're leaving North Carolina, where I live. It's not going to stop in Europe. It's a problem of global proportions that has to be solved by a cooperation that has heretofore never happened among the world's nation states. So my hope is that there's going to be an awakening on the part of the scientific community, and it has not happened yet. When you hear a story on NPR, or you hear anybody being interviewed about climate change, how often did you hear anybody say anything about the Pentagon or war? I mean, they don't make the connection to war. I completely and totally believe that we cannot stop climate change until we abolish war. I used to not be a hardline pacifist where, I thought, okay, we have to have a pacifist view. You got to agree with me. It's sort of like, there were people out there who said, well, I'm a nuclear pacifist, but I think sometimes we have to have our Pentagon ready to defend people who are, in countries where they're being oppressed. And, there's all these arguments that make to keep the Pentagon there. And just, it's sort of like trying to say, like, I would say this is analogous to people saying, well, police just need better training. We don't need to defund and abolish the police. It's just a lack of training. They need to be taught to, to do their jobs better. They're just not trained properly. Well, I'm in favor of defunding the police. And I always say we have to abolish the 3 Ps, the Pentagon, the police, and the prisons. They're not redeemable, and so I've now really taken a position that pacifism's our only hope. I don't think we can coexist with the Pentagon and save the earth. The Pentagon's got to go. War has to be abolished. And I'm a newspaper reader. I like to have the newspaper in my hands, and I read the Wall Street Journal pretty regularly because I like to see that's where you can really see how the people that we oppose think the Wall Street Journal really tells the story. And if you really look, you pick up the Wall Street Journal every day, there's a very, very strong effort to create a new Cold War with China. Now, here we are, never at a time when we and China need to be cooperating, 2 biggest carbon footprints in the world. And what we want to do is start a Cold War, which is going to only jeopardize any efforts at reducing climate change. Mm-hmm. So everything that they're doing is the opposite of what is called for and necessary and urgent. So that's a long answer to your question. I'm hoping that the scientific community will now say the time is up. We got to get rid of war. We have to be a world of peace if we want to save the earth. Right. So hopefully that's going to happen.
I don't know what you're implying is that the anti-nuclear movement, the nuclear disarmament movement, needs to go into the climate change movement and make common cause. There are actually in recent months, I'm more and more frequently seeing that people are making the connection with the military contribution to climate change. And we now have and I asked Ellen Barfield, who's holding up a publication here. I'm going to ask her to comment. We now have a working group in Veterans Peace called the Climate Change and Militarism Project, I think is what it's called. And is that their publication, Ellen?
Yep, this is the #1 flyer of the project. There were a couple of people at Glasgow connected to the US Veterans for Peace Climate Change and Militarism Working Group. And they did everything they could. And I was thrilled yesterday, just inadvertently, I had the time to listen to the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance report back from Glasgow. A bunch of them were there, and they spoke very boldly about militarism's got to go. It was recorded, and I will send the link when I get it because it was fabulous. And a good number of peace activists, including myself and a lot of the people I know in Baltimore and Washington, have been reaching out to climate folks for years, many years, saying, if you don't challenge the Pentagon, we'll never get there. They say we can't afford it. That's where the money is. And we cannot afford those massive emissions that aren't even reported. And that's part of what this flyer talks about, is that since Kyoto and the US government's insistence, military emissions do not have to be reported. So yes, the US has a huge carbon footprint, but it's a lot huger than most people know.
Right. Cindy Peister has an article today. She's an associate member of Veterans for Peace. Article about this very thing today in Popular Resistance. A very good article. So I'll be sharing that around. So that's definitely a direction we should be looking towards, because there's so many young people mobilized and aware of climate change who have no clue hardly about the danger of nuclear war. Well, somebody else have a question or comment for Patrick?
Well, Patrick, this is Jim Wolgemuth from Nashville, the Hector Black chapter. And Harvey and I do a little radio show. One day we'd like to get you on it. But last week we were talking to Ralph Hutchison from the Oak Ridge Environmental. Yeah, OREPA. And they're planning a big event around the anniversary of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons coming up to January 22nd with whatever. What are you going to do, or what should we be doing to call attention to that? Because like Jerry just said, the information is really not getting out there very well about the danger of nuclear weapons.
Well, I worked, closely with Ralph, and he actually was the court reporter for our trial. He came down to Brunswick. He's got a photographic memory, Ralph. He's brilliant, and he can basically hear something, write it down, and it's word for word accurate. And I said, would you please come and be our court reporter? And he was. I have incredible admiration. I mean, anything that Ralph puts out is comprehensive and brilliantly done, and he's keeping this secret life of Oak Ridge in the forefront and exposing it for all of its evil. And I can't say enough about. And I've spent a lot of time in East Tennessee, both in Knoxville and at Oak Ridge, supporting the work that they do there, and I'm just really pleased. I think obviously on the anniversary of the treaty, our job is to call attention to the fact that our country didn't sign, and we have to keep pressing the issue that you look at China and this escalating effort to estrange our relationship even further, right? So we're engaged in a process that's not helping diplomacy at all. It's what it's doing is creating a more dangerous world, and the Chinese and Putin can say the exact same thing. We're the only country that ever used atomic weapons on a civilian population. We created them. We tested them first. We jeopardized the lives and the futures of so many people in the South Pacific through our recklessness. And we have all of these sites that are now polluted and giving people cancer all around our own country that are related to radiation deaths that are being caused by our recklessness. I always try, and I think Veterans for Peace is in a good position to point out to people that the Pentagon is recruiting people as cannon fodder. And why are people who are coming out of the military having such a hard time getting cared for? I mean, why are there 37,000 homeless veterans in this country? It seems to me that homeless veterans shouldn't be a term in our vernacular. There should be nobody who went off and went off to war and risked their lives for the country that doesn't have a roof over their head. I mean, this is obscene. The Pentagon gets more than $1 million a minute, and we can't stop homelessness among our veterans. So you've got a lot of good inroads, and I've never, for the life of me, understood how the VFW and how, well, I don't understand how these veterans groups, all of these veterans groups that are out there, VFW being, probably the most prominent one, but why have they turned because what we do is, what the military does as a strategy in this country is that we have 6 days a year that are devoted not to memorializing the death and the suffering of people who went to war, but in promoting the proliferation and the continuation of war. So now we have Veterans Day, we have Armed Forces Day, we have Flag Day, we have Independence Day, and we have now, of course, we have Patriots Day. They've turned 9/11 into another scam to a Memorial Day. So we have these 6 holidays that are interspersed throughout the calendar year that are really just designed to promote war. You can try to clean it all up and say, oh, this is about the loss of life and the sacrifices people have made. But really, most of these holidays are designed to promote the war machine and the continuation of the military industrial complex. And I think Veterans for Peace is in the best position to expose the lack of care and concern that the Pentagon has for its own soldiers and what they're willing to sacrifice in terms of the lives of our own military. And I think that the arms race is something that, to me, it's a simple thing to say that we can't. What we're saying about the arms race is, based on the acronym, mutually assured destruction. And a lot of people will say, okay, for 75 years, there's been no nuclear weapons used, and they're sort of promoting that as some kind of evidence that mutually assured destruction works. But the problem is, mutually assured destruction has to last in perpetuity. The first time that it doesn't work, it's been a failure. Mm-hmm. And we know now that the proliferation of, Korea's figured it out, right? Korea figured it out. And, India, Pakistan, people who have the nukes figured it out. The only way you can keep from becoming Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein in this world and being wiped out by the US is to have your own nukes. It's the only thing that'll keep the US from attacking you. So everything in our foreign policy is geared toward nuclear proliferation. And so we have to point that out to people. We have to point that out, that we're not doing, that our military has nothing to do with defense. We've got to somehow crack that lie. It's not about defense. It's about war making, and it's about money. And, the war, I had a friend of mine who, his name is Jeremy Hinsman. He lives in Canada now, but he was the first US soldier to go to Canada during the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And he was an intellectual. He lived a little bit of time at our Catholic worker house, and he became really world famous because he's a brilliant, articulate guy and a great anti-war spokesperson, and, he applied for nuclear. He was in Afghanistan, and he decided he was a pacifist. He couldn't kill. And he filed he's in Iraq, and he filed a request for conscientious objector status. And this thing took a long process. Then they told him that they lost it. Then they deployed him to Iraq. They told me he's going to have to deploy to Iraq. As soon as he filed the CO, he was in Afghanistan first. He filed the CO request. He was spending 16 hours a day, 7 days a week working KP, right? He was being punished, and he was an example for everybody. You tell them that you don't want to kill, and this is what's going to happen to you. So when he went back to Fort Bragg after the deployment, they told him he was going to have to go to Iraq and that they'd lost his conscientious objector request. They lost all the paperwork, right? And so he went AWOL, went to Canada, but I interviewed Jeremy in an article that was in the New York Catholic Worker newspaper. But if you look up Jeremy's name, Hinzman, you can read tons of interviews with him all over the world. He had a breakthrough interview in the Village Voice in New York City back then, and that sort of spread. Like when I visited him up in Canada, we were walking down the street together, and somebody from from the Boston Globe and somebody from the BBC were interviewing as we walked. He really became a great spokesman. But he told me at Fort Bragg, they would have these shoulder launched missile, it's like, I guess it's like a bazooka. I don't know what it's called. But he said they were meant to work only one time. You shoot them and you throw the thing away. And he said that at the end of the fiscal year, they just went out at Fort Bragg and just spent the whole day shooting these things off, because if they used them up, they could have justification to order new weapons. So there was no purpose to it. And each one of those things was $1,000. And he said, we just sit all day long shooting them off. And this is the kind of complete disregard for fiscal responsibility that the military engages in, the Pentagon engages in, and the complete disregard they have for human life. So I can't, the reason I became an associate of Veterans for Peace is I realized this is the only organization that really has credibility the minute they step into the argument. They can't dismiss Veterans for Peace because you've already made the ultimate sacrifice, which is their term, but it's true. I mean, it's true. So I think Veterans for Peace, it's just an organization I want to be affiliated with. And I with regard to the anti-nuclear movement, I just want to encourage people to resist war and nuclear weapons in any way they feel called to. I mean, in order for me to be able to go to prison several times during my life and to participate in this kind of stuff, I really have the support of a large community of friends and family, and my wife and my children. And not everybody can do this kind of work. And I'm not trying to recruit for plowshare actions. I do think people should consider engaging in nonviolent direct action. I think it's important to be in handcuffs and be dragged into a jail because you're opposed to war. And I think that's going to really be part of your understanding that to do this kind of resistance in our imperial country, there are consequences. And I think people should experience those consequences. But I'm not saying, go to prison for as long as I've gone to prison. I mean, I certainly would be happy to give people some one-on-one advice if they're interested, but I don't necessarily consider myself. I guess I let my actions speak, not my words. I'm not a recruiter. I don't want to recruit. And I want to give a good example. I'm sure a lot of you guys, my first contact with the Veterans for Peace was at the School of the Americas, where they had a march coming in to Columbus, Georgia, to Fort Benning. Back in the Ellen, of course, can tell you, both Ellens on this call can tell you about it, but Ellen especially, because she and I would march together down in Columbus when the Veterans for Peace would come in. It was really exciting to see them all march in on the first day of the resistance there. But that was my first contact with Veterans for Peace, was at the School of the Americas, and I want to be part of that movement. I want to be part of that effort. And I feel like when I'm surrounded by people in Veterans for Peace, I've got a lot more credibility as an activist myself, that I'm embracing a group of people who have seen the worst of it and have turned against the war machine and said no. So this is an important life to live and an important position to take.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation and a life well lived, a great example. We're glad that you're an associate member of Veterans for Peace, and we know a number of people in that Triangle chapter. That's a fantastic group of folks.
Yeah, we have a great group there,
including our old friend John Hewer, who's passed a few years ago. Did you know John?
I wrote an obituary for him. I could probably try to make that available to you, but that was, since I'm a journalist and I do write a lot of obituaries, I talked to his wife, and John was a dear friend. I mean, anyone who knew John, and maybe several of you did, but if you were looking for somebody who represented a walking, talking, living, nonviolent human being, I mean, you really kind of thought, this guy's holy like Jesus was holy. And I don't say that in a way that's sacrilegious. I'm saying he embodied the life of Christ. He really did. And I'm not even sure if he really had a religious sentimentality, but he was so gentle, so loving, so deep, so deeply human.
Right.
That's it. And then, there's Leadham and there's Doug and Vicky Ryder, and there's a whole bunch of people in the Triangle Veterans for Peace group. And I'm really glad to be mentored by them. There's another associate, Roger Ehrlich, who some of you might know, who built the Swords into Plowshares Peace Tower. And I've worked very, very closely with Roger over the years and really appreciated that. But I like I said, I think that everybody's doing honorable things in this culture, to say no to war is you are a big outlier in the culture. We have a lot of work to do to convince people that killing each other is not a pathway to a better world. And I think that's a logical statement. Killing each other is not a pathway to a better world. I don't know why it's so hard to convince people of that. The one thing, you see people now, I'll make this final comment. I know we're out of time, but now you notice that what the newspapers are saying is that people are becoming more pro-police again because there's been a rise in crime, okay? And so now people are not wanting to defund the police because crime's been going up, all right? But I've never seen any empirical evidence ever presented by anyone that having more people with guns willing to kill other people is somehow making us safer. Where is the empirical evidence that having more police reduces crime? Where's the empirical evidence that killing lots of people? 3 million North Vietnamese perished in the Vietnam War. And we talk about our 55,000, and that's meaningful because they're you. They were your people. But 3 million North Vietnamese wiped out. That's 3 million people. According to the United Nations, at the turn of the millennium, the UN put out a report that said 170 million people died as a direct consequence of war in the 20th century. Now think about that. 1.7 million people a year for 100 years. More than 90% were civilians, and most of those were women and children. Wow. Now, how does, what justifies 1.7 million people a year for 100 years? How are we embracing that as a successful endeavor? But that's insane. And so we have to convince people of that. And you wonder why it's such a hard sell. But it's because of brainwashing. And everybody knows this. My children, I have 8 children. Every single one of them was in preschool, and they tried to make them say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag before they knew what the words meant. The indoctrination begins very, very early. We show people things that are religious ritual. I mean, pledging allegiance to the flag, that's like praying, right? You're putting your hand over your heart. You're staring at this banner, and you're saying a prayer essentially. And so, and really, anytime you see a politician speak, they're not only wearing a American flag lapel, but they're standing in front of like flags and flags and flags. So if you ingrain that in children, that they always have a positive response to seeing a flag, well, that builds up, and a lot of, and then of course you have a public education system that is not the people's history of the United States. So we have to educate people in things they've never heard before or never thought of. When I tell people my children don't pledge allegiance to the flag, they don't sing the national anthem, and they look at me like, they can't believe that there's such a thing. I mean, when I would go to school every year and tell the teachers on the first day of school, none of us in our family pledge allegiance to the flag. The teachers would sometimes be angry about that, angry about it. They couldn't understand, why would you not want to honor this country? Well, you use it as an opportunity to educate people, right? So.
Well, Patrick, the purpose of this nuclear abolition working group of Veterans for Peace is to educate ourselves and mobilize Veterans for Peace to be a force to help build up the movement for nuclear disarmament. We meet every 2 weeks. We're still figuring out how we're going to effectively make a difference as veterans, and using our veterans' voice, as you referenced. You're very welcome to join us, and anytime. We'll make sure you're.
Well, keep me on the email list. Yeah, I mean, you've got enough people on this call that could say exactly what I'm saying. You got a smart crowd, so we got to stop talking to each other, I guess, and figure out a way to get that message out. A few months ago when I was in prison, somebody got USA Today, and I'd get it the next day or 2 days later. But you know how they have the little polls down in the bottom left-hand corner of the front page. And it said that that in a particular poll, the approval rating for the military was 69%. I told that to my friend Steve Deere, who's a great activist in Eugene, Oregon. Steve said, "Oh, I think it's more than 90%." But I mean, if the military just has this reputation for holiness and goodness, how do we begin to tear that down? How do we begin to tell the truth and give people a new construct? I mean, I don't really have the answers to that. I'm kind of like, we're all pulling straws here, trying to find out. But I think we just got to keep telling the truth. That's the one wonderful thing about our work is we do have the truth on our side. Absolutely the truth.
Amen.
Killing people is not the way to live as a human family. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Patrick, I would like.
Hey, Ellen.
Hi. I would like to say that if you have any particular things that you hear about, because you're out and about with a lot of people that are working on these issues and in good ways, if you'd share them with us, because it might either trigger us to join you or trigger us to do something similar.
Yeah, I'll be happy to Ellen, to stay in email contact with you. Of course, I guess everybody knows about the Pratt Whitney work that you're engaged in Buncombe County and in Asheville, but that's the kind of work that needs to be done. That kind of grassroots effort to educate people that what's happening here is an abomination, and they're doing that in Asheville. Our Witness for Peace chapter gave Ellen's group their annual Peace Award this year for the work that's happening against Pratt Whitney. So we're recognizing that as being exceptional.
Go ahead, Alice.
We can't hear you, Alice.
I just want to tell you some really good news. Like the New York City Council removed Thomas Jefferson's statue because he owned slaves this week.
Wow.
And the city council just passed a resolution calling on Biden to sign the new ban treaty, the New York City Council. So I think that people are on the move, New York, if you can do it here, you'll do it anywhere. And it's starting. I mean, even somebody talked about our congressional delegation, that they were the only one that had majority that vote. I didn't even know that.
8-5.
So I don't want to just boast about New York, but I want to let you know that there's hope on the way. I mean, like, I'm very, even though everything's awful and, we see what's happening, I think there is some rising energy. People are starting to get it, I think.
And Alice, what you can think about, Alice, is that New York has now become a major city that has suffered the consequences of enormous consequences of violence. It's changed the people of New York. What happened on September 11, 2001 forever changed that city. It was an incredible changing experience, and people are remembering it. They're remembering it. And in those 20 years, we've still never asked the question, what motivated 19 young men to sacrifice their lives through this mutual act of suicide while murdering 3,000 people? What was the motivation for their actions? We still never satisfactorily inquired as to why that happened.
They still haven't declassified the 911 report, which Trump, the broken clock, wanted to do. And they haven't declassified the Kennedy assassination, the one bullet. So we don't know everything. I mean, we know we're getting a lot of baloney, and we have to start, and they're starting to tell the truth, I think, about things. I think that's happening, and we have to, we're coming from veterans, because you guys have such cred with the public. It's good when you say it. It's very powerful.
Okay, well, with that in mind, we're going to move on. We have a little bit of business to discuss. You're welcome to stay, Patrick, but thank you so much. We really got a lot out of your presentation.
I left a meeting to get on this call, which I'm going to get back to with. This is the first time I've seen my co-defendants since before we went to prison. So it's a very important gathering. So God bless all of you, and keep resisting. I always like to quote every letter I sent out of prison. I quoted Professor Maury Schwartz, who said, "Love is the only rational act." I'll end on that.
Love to all of them, Patrick, and you too.
I sure will. All right, Ellen. Thank you.
Bye.